Hi everyone, it's Courtney, and today we're going to be creating a card with the Far Out Friends stamp set, the Stellar Sentiment stamp set and die set, as well as the Balloon Alphabet and Balloon Numbers die sets. So I'm starting off with a piece of Neenah Solar White 80-pound cardstock here, and this is cut just a little bit larger than an A2 size card. I had a different plan in mind when I started this card, and you'll see why in a minute, why this is cut a little bit larger, but I did draw a very light pencil line just to kind of guide me as far as what the A2 size actually is. Then I'm going to take the stamps that I'm going to be using as well as the dies that I'm going to be using for my little scene here and just laying them out onto my card panel just strictly for placement, so I can kind of guide myself as far as where my images need to be stamped and where my dies need to be placed. Once I was happy with that, I went ahead and die cut the balloons with some Simon Says stamp masking paper and stuck those down right along that pencil line. Two of the ones in the middle, are slightly above the line, very, very slightly, and the other two are a little bit below it because I want those to kind of hang off my card base. You'll see in the end. So once those were placed down, then I can go ahead and stamp out my images. I'm going to bring out my Misty for these because they are fairly large and I've never used a stamp set before and I don't usually condition my stamps. I just use them over and over and never really have a problem. So I am going to lay out the moon first. There's a large image in the stamp set that is basically the top portion of the moon. So I'm going to lay that down onto the bottom portion of my panel and I'm going to stamp this out twice with some blackout ink by Ink on 3, which is a Copic Safe ink. And then I'm also going to stamp this onto that same Simon Says stamp masking paper and fussy cut that and just lay that out directly over the image. When you're lining up masks and you plan on doing some ink blending in the background like I am, you want to try to cut right along the black outline of the image and try your best to lay it down as evenly as you can on the paper. What I like to do, this image is fairly easy, but what I typically do is start with the most intricate area, you know, the most detailed area, and lay that down first. And then usually the mask kind of falls into place after that. So once that was done, I moved my card panel to the corner of the Misty just in case I had to restamp my images later on because I knew my background was going to be so dark. And I went ahead and stamped out my little astronaut as well as the Earth. Again, same thing with the blackout ink, and also stamp these onto the masking paper as well. Now for the mask for this little astronaut little guy, I cut normally. I cut right along the black outline, then realized his little helmet would be clear. You'd see through it. So I would be able to see the background through it. So I'm going to cut around the helmet. So once everything was cut, I'm going to just basically cut around his hair and his face so that there is no mask for the helmet itself. Went ahead and laid those down, and then I'll move on to the ink blending. I'm going to speed it up a little bit during the ink blending just because I'm sure you guys have seen this done a million times and there's so many different ways to do it, but I am going to create a galaxy background and I'm going to use regular Distress inks. You can use Distress Oxides, there's tons of different inks that you could use, but I'm using the Distress inks just in case I need to color over any of the areas. They're more Copic Safe than the oxides are. So I'm taking a blending brush here and I'm just taking a variety of bright colored Distress inks. I think that was Crushed Olive. I have, I can't remember the name of this one, but I will link it below, and a pink and a purple. And then once my brighter colors are down, and I'm not really worried about blending them, I'm just kind of plopping down the color wherever I want it to be. And once the brighter colors were down, then I can bring in the darker colors to kind of darken everything up and make it look like a night sky, or a galaxy sky, I should say. And I'm going to start off with the Chipped Sapphire, which is a very dark navy blue. And I'm going to start with just the edges. Now, because I'm using Distress inks and not Distress Oxides, well, it's kind of true for both of them, but more for the regular Distress inks because these are a dye ink. You want to kind of slowly build the color. You don't want to go in with too heavy of a hand and with too much ink on whatever tool that you're using, because that's how you're going to get those blotchy lines that you're not going to be able to spread out or blend out like you normally would with Distress Oxides. These kind of stick to the paper immediately. So once I had the chipped sapphire down, I'm adding a little bit of the black soot just around the edges to darken up the edges a little bit more. And then I can kind of work that out towards the center again with the chipped sapphire once again. And this is where I'm going to kind of cover all of those bright colors. You'll still be able to see through them because the Distress inks are not opaque like the oxides are. So you see them a little bit more through those darker colors. Once the ink blending was done, I wanted to add some stars and some sparkle to the background. I do not have any shimmer spray, but I do have the liquid pixie spray or liquid pixie dust, I think it's called, by Ink on 3. And I figured that was the next best thing. So I just squeezed a little bit of that out onto an acrylic block and then used a paintbrush to kind of spatter that around. I didn't even have to pick this up with a paper towel. It kind of just absorbed into the paper rather quickly, and it's somewhat thick, so it doesn't saturate your paper too much. Now, it didn't really look like stars because this is a little bit more, I don't know, clear, I guess. It's just really clear sparkle. So I added a little bit of white gouache with the remaining sparkle that I have still on that acrylic block, mixed that together and spattered that on my background. Now I did let my background dry for probably about a half an hour or so before removing the masks. And I definitely recommend doing this, especially when you have a whole bunch of ink down and you did spatters in the background. Your paper's pretty wet. So if you don't wait for it to dry and you immediately remove those masks, sometimes when you remove those masks, because of the stickiness to them, it can actually tear your paper. So I made sure that this was nice and good and dry before I removed those. I did have some areas that still stuck down really good, but luckily it didn't tear my paper enough where I couldn't just color over it anyway. But that would be my recommendation. I've had far too many cards ruined because I was impatient. So once the masks were removed, then I can move on to the Copic coloring of the stamped images. And again, I'm going to speed this up because I kept it pretty basic. But for the skin, I'm going to start off with my lightest color, map out those darkest areas, which is basically just underneath his hair and underneath his little chin. Go on to the darkest color, then the two midtones and the lightest color again. And I'm coloring right over his eyes and mouth, and you'll see in the finish once I get to the end of the video, I forgot to fill in his mouth, but I did later before I took the photos. But to cover in the eyes or to get the whites back in the eyes, I just used a white gel pen. Now for his hair, I would normally not do the shading this way. However, my mask kind of lifted a little bit when I did my ink blending. So in order to cover that up, I needed the darkest area to be on the top of his head. So I'm just creating the highlight to be in the center basically. So I'm just adding some shading on the top and bottom, and I'm just using flicking motions to kind of give his hair a little bit of texture. Now for his spacesuit, this is pretty much all going to be cool grays. So I'm going to go in with my darkest color first, which is a C7. It's a very, very dark color. And I'm just adding this to the very, very darkest, very darkest areas, I should say. So I'm not going to add it to all of the shadow areas. I'm just going to add it to the very darkest ones. Then once I bring in the C5, then I can go ahead and start adding some more shadows. His little spacesuit there has kind of like sections to it, and there may be a technical term to that, but I don't know what it is. You guys know me, I never know technical terms, but there would be a little bit of a shadow in between each one of these. But I didn't want to go in with my darkest color because the areas are so small that I wouldn't really have too much room for my highlight. So you can still add shadows and shading with your mid-tone colors if you don't need them to be as dark. So that's what I did. I added some shading with that C5. And then I'll bring in the C3, and I'm just going to extend these areas out a little bit. And you'll see that I'm leaving a pretty large area for these larger areas for the highlight color, just because I don't want his spacesuit to be too dark and blend in with my really dark background. So I'm going to finish off with the C1 and just kind of blend these out a little bit. The C markers are so easy to blend. I never really have a problem with that. Now for the little center portion of his spacesuit, I don't know what you call it, but it has like little controls on it, I would say. So for the background of this, or I'm going to call it a little control panel, I'm going to color this in black. So I'm actually going to bring out my black marker and just add a little shading to either side, blend that out with the C7 and finish off with the C5 in the center. And then I'm just going to go in solid with a red marker to fill in the little buttons. I didn't bother to do any shading on these little tiny areas. So for the earth, I am going to use obviously some blues and greens. Starting off with the blues, I'm going to add a little bit of shading to the outside of this circle. And then I'm also going to add little, I don't know, I can't even call them wavy lines. They're kind of just dashes. They're kind of zigzaggy. And I'm going to blend those out each time as I work down towards my lightest color. And this is just going to add a little bit of texture to it, or a little bit of interest to it. So it's not just plain blue and green. For the greens, I didn't bother to do that because the land is actually less than the water. So I just added a little bit of shading on either side and then blended that out with the two remaining greens. Now for the moon, normally I would use some warm gray markers for the moon, but my warm grays are they're just about done as far as the ink goes, and I have no refills. So I'm going to get a little creative, and thank you very much to my friend Renee. She recommended a different color combination, but I did kind of look through my stash of markers and found one that is somewhat similar. So I'm adding a little bit of shading to kind of some random areas. There's really no rhyme or reason for it with a C3. Then I'm going to go in with a V22, which is obviously a purple, but it's more of a muted purple. I very rarely use the V20s. I just don't really care for the color, but it was actually really good for the moon. So I'm going to blend it out a little bit with the V20, and then I'm going to finish off with the C1, and I'm just going to cover up the entire moon. And that way I have a little bit of that purple showing, so it doesn't look too much like his spacesuit. So for the letters, I wanted these to kind of look like the moon as well. So I stamped out some extra moons and I colored them the same way. I'm not going to show you this same coloring over and over, but once they were colored, I'm going to line up my dies onto these images, stick them down with some Post-it note tape just so that they don't shift around when going through my Gemini, and ran that through my die cutting machine. That way I have a little bit of a pattern, almost like I use pattern paper, which you can certainly do, onto my little balloons. Now, once I die cut them, I realized, and I kind of put them against my background, they were a little too light. So I decided to make these just a little bit darker than the actual moon on my scene. And I took my C3. Instead of my C1, I used my C3 and I just covered up the entire little balloon just to kind of darken them up to make them stand out against the background a little bit. Now, before I adhere these down, I want to make sure that I cut down my panel. Remember that this panel was a little bit larger than an A2 size card. So I'm going to just use my paper trimmer here and cut that down. I think it was like 1/4 of an inch or something, that it was a little bit larger. And you can see that my letters are just slightly hanging off the top. It's fine. They're die cut, so I can always add that back in with the dies. And then before I adhere the dies down, I don't want any of this white to be showing through where I masked them out for placement. So I'm just taking a B99, which is a really super dark blue, and that will blend in with the background. That way, if I don't adhere these completely perfect, which I usually don't, if a little bit of this blue is peeking through, it's going to kind of just blend in with the background and nobody will notice the difference. Now, instead of popping these up, being some of these are going to hang off my panel just a little bit, I decided to glue these down flat. I'm using some Tombow Mono Multi Glue. It dries fairly quickly, but still gives me a couple of seconds to kind of shift things around if needed, which of course I needed those couple of seconds because I can't ever line anything up correctly. Now, in the balloon alphabet and balloon numbers die sets, there's little strings that you can die cut. And I went ahead and die cut these out of some heavyweight black cardstock. And I want to kind of position these so that they are obviously coming off from the balloon, but they're also meeting his little hand that's sticking up in the air. So some of these I did have to kind of snip a little bit of an off to make it fit. But once again, I'm using a little bit of this wet glue because I can't line things up right, and it gives me a couple of seconds to trim any remaining or excess of that string that I need to. Now, there's also little bows that are part of the die set. And I was originally going to put those on where the string meets the balloon, but I thought it just took up too much and it didn't really, I guess it just didn't really fit my scene. So I decided to skip that. For my card base, I'm just taking a tiny bit off because remember our panel kind of has jagged edges. So I want to lay this flat towards the bottom of my card panel. That way just the letters are sticking up from where the card is folded, if that makes any sense. That way it will still fit into an envelope. So next, adding some details here, I'm going to add a little bit of sparkle to my balloons with the Nuvo Aqua Shimmer pen. And I am also going to add 2 layers of sparkle to his little space helmet. And this will kind of get the ink to move a little bit because it is water-based, and it will stick out a little bit. So it doesn't look like just a round circle around his head. It actually looks like a helmet. It's a little hard to see on camera, but if you let it dry for a couple of seconds and then add another layer, it's really going to boost it up. You just have to be a little bit careful not to go directly over your image because you're kind of moving that ink around. It's easy to make his little face navy blue if you're not too careful. So next I added some glossy accents, which I'm super low on, but I was able to squeeze out just enough to fill in my little balloons here. And this will just give it some extra shine. I added a white gel pen detail to his helmet. And once the glossy accents was dry, I also added it to that, but that does take a couple of hours. And to finish off the sentiment, because I just wasn't liking the way it was looking, it was a little too bare, I am using the Stellar Sentiments stamp and die set. I want my cardstock to be gray and to match everything. So I'm taking my C3 and just adding a little bit of color to some white cardstock, just a scrap piece. And I'm going to stamp out one of the sentiments with some VersaFine Onyx Black ink. Keep in mind this is a pigment ink, so it does take a minute or so to dry. Once that was dry, I took the coordinating die, lined that up, stuck that down again with some Post-it note tape and ran that through. Again, I just needed a little bit more. I just wasn't liking it. So I took another piece of scrap paper here, colored it the same way, and stamped out the rest of the sentiment. But this one doesn't have the matching die. So the matching die set will basically cut out all of the sentiments that are capitalized. So Earthling is all in caps, so you know that it has a matching die to go along with it. Very easy to line up, but this one doesn't. So I tried to do it myself. Did it come out as good as the die? No, not at all. But I did fussy cut it just to kind of match everything and then adhered these down right above my moon there in the center of the panel. And that is it. That is the card for today. I will leave all of the supplies I used today in the description box below. Thank you guys so much for stopping by and have a great day. Bye.